Hello, my name is Costa Manolchev. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Exeter Business School. And today, I would like to talk to you about negative acts. Now, negative acts are an umbrella term for a wide spectrum of behaviors. And I'd like to discuss and define what some of those are, then discuss the cost of them, both to the individual in terms of personal impact and in terms of organizational cost. Then I would like to share some of the findings of our research into negative behaviors and explain why negative acts may be deemed to be contagious. I'd like to discuss what that means in just a moment. And I'd like to conclude with discussing some of the steps that we can take to ensure individuals are left and not left unsupported when those behaviors occur. So in 2020, the UK Home Secretary, Priti Patel, faced accusations and allegations of bullying behaviours by her team. Also in 2020, we had the protests following the killing of George Floyd whilst being detained by the police, which can be an example of institutional violence. So bullying, harassment, institutional violence are all behaviours which can broadly be defined as negative acts. There are others which can fit in this very broad umbrella, and those could be mobbing, incivility, violence, mistreatment, and so on and so forth. Now, despite almost 4 decades of research into negative behavior, those acts remain hidden for the organization. Those acts remain invisible, both for the organization, which simply might not know what the true extent of negative acts might be, even if it knows they're taking place. They might be invisible to the bully, who is completely unaware of the toxic impact of their behavior. And finally, they may be invisible to the victim, who might be very resilient and who might also be unaware that the constant criticism and intervening from a senior manager they experience on a daily basis in fact constitutes bullying. In fact, they might resent the bullying and the victim label altogether and refuse to acknowledge it or report it. Now, we know that typically negative acts are rife in the healthcare industry, both in the UK, in the US, New Zealand, in Australia. And we know that employees from a Black, Asian minority ethnic background are likely to encounter those acts. The Race at Work report in 2019 suggested that almost 25% of BAME employees are likely to encounter those acts at work. Now, unfortunately, in this case, the BAME acronym is not very helpful because it clusters together very different experiences. In this case, Asian and Afro-Caribbean workers are likely to be insulted and experience the hurling of offences to their face, whereas Chinese employees and Chinese workers are likely to be ignored and ostracised and excluded from the workplace. Now, bullying and harassment are by far the most frequent of those behaviours. Now, harassment has a very clear legal definition. It's unwanted, unnecessary, and discriminatory behaviours based on a protected characteristic. The protected characteristics might be age, gender, sexual identity, and is very clearly defined by the Equality Act of 2010. Bullying, however, doesn't have a legal definition. In fact, bullying is not illegal, strictly speaking, from a legal perspective. And that's why it's so difficult to identify. In order to have bullying rather than the occasional infraction or tension or clash with a colleague, we need to have an instance of prolonged behavior. Employee A needs to be treating employee B in a very negative and unwanted way at least once a week and for a period of 6 months or more. This behavior might be verbal attacks. This might be at one end, the employee simply intervening, a manager intervening into the work of another employee, or at the other extreme end of the spectrum, simply being unavailable, not providing key information required for the day-to-day work. I refer to a manager and an employee because power imbalance is another critical feature of bullying. Usually, the victim is lower down the employment hierarchy than the manager and therefore can't escape. The victim can't retaliate. And they can't report the behavior because the person they would typically be reporting is the person most likely doing the bullying. Now, unlike the 2 headlines I started with, I'd like to now discuss Jenny's story. And Jenny is somebody I met during my research into bullying and harassment. I met Jenny in the summer of 2016. Jenny's not her real name, it's a pseudonym that I've given her to protect her identity because she's a niche consultant. And in fact, there are probably less than 10 people in the UK doing what she does. Now, Jenny loves her job, she's very good at it, and that's been evidenced by 2 regional excellence awards that she has received for her work. Her clients are also very happy with her work. The person who is not, or wasn't at the time, was her manager. Her manager was continually critiquing Jenny's work, the way she handled her clients, the kind of interventions she put in place for the portfolios she managed. And that had been happening for a period of 12 months or more, when Jenny decided that enough was enough. She decided to confront her manager and explain the impact this constant criticism is having on her in a professional sense and personally. So she asked to meet him. She started the conversation. She explained the impact this was having. And midway, he interrupted her. And he simply said, "It sounds like you're struggling to do your job. And if you can't do your job, you should consider leaving." Jenny remembers finishing the conversation, and she remembers driving home in a daze, and she remembers going home and making a snack for her son. And then she collapsed with a sharp pain in her chest and a restrictive, constricting tightness. And as she went down on her knees, she was holding onto the table for support, whilst listening to her son calling for an ambulance, asking for help, and going to her and saying, "Mummy, Mummy, are you okay?" Now, Jenny didn't have a heart attack. She, in fact, experienced a panic attack. It was her first one. It was a particularly severe one. But unfortunately, panic attacks are not the only way in which bullying and harassment can impact a victim of bullying. The individual impact is incredibly severe, and it can range from anxiety to insecurity to a level of anguish which is comparable to those suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. Over time, bullying can increase in severity, and the victim can start changing the way he or she views the world. She ceases, or he ceases, to believe that the world is a good place and that they have a place in it, and that can lead to suicide ideation. Unfortunately, even when there's a support network around the victim, that support decreases over time. Friends and colleagues and family become less interested in hearing about those regular issues at work, and they withdraw their support. Secondary bullying ensues. The cost, however, goes beyond the dyadic relationship between the bully and the victim, toxic and disruptive though it is. The cost to organizations is huge. Klein and Lewis in 2019 estimated that in the very particular field of the UK's National Health Service, bullying harassment in terms of lost working days, in terms of staff absence, turnover, employee claims against the organisation, amounted to over £2 billion per annum, on top of an already outstretched organisation in terms of budget and in terms of staffing issues. Now, when we look at negative acts, it's very normal, and researchers tend to focus on the relationship between the bully and the victim. But we do know that bullying doesn't happen in a vacuum. There are usually people around it. They're witnesses. And however, in the literature, whenever the witness is discussed, they're seen as also a secondary victim, as somebody who is just there, doesn't have a particularly key role to play, but might be affected detrimentally because of the observed behavior. Our research, however, has uncovered a very worrying trend which suggests that that is not necessarily the case. Using nationally representative data from the Irish Workplace Behaviour Study, we found that witnesses of bullying and harassment can be 10 times more likely to become bullies themselves, even in instances when the witness is a generally good person who has a strong moral and value framework. So how is this possible? How is it possible that witnesses can become desensitized to the acts they observe? And not only desensitized, but start engaging and perpetrating them themselves. This kind of behavior is not new. And researchers, as early as Philip Zimbardo in his Stanford experiments, have identified a similar trend. Human beings experience schadenfreude, joy derived from the suffering of others. That is possible. But in a very specific context of bullying and harassment, we put forward an explanation based on Herbert Blumer's symbolic interactionism theory. Symbolic interactionism looks at the way we, as human beings, form meaning. In other words, the way we understand complex ideas such as love and friendship and duty. And according to symbolic interactionism, those ideas make sense to us through the way we interact with others, by adapting and incorporating the meaning of other people in our immediate surrounding. However, our research takes this further by suggesting and showing that not only do interactions with others help influence the meanings we form, but also the behavior that we engage in. In other words, over time, not only do we become desensitized to this behavior, but we normalize it. We adapt it as part of our own behavioral responses to different situations. And this is especially so if the organization is not taking any steps to stop or to punish the perpetrators of those behaviors. This is how behavior such as bullying and harassment becomes contagious, and this is how it can damage not only the dyad of bullying victim, but the organization as a whole. This suggests that when they occur, bullying and harassment and other negative acts cannot be left unchecked. They cannot be overlooked. And we, as managers, as employees, we have a duty to intervene. How? Hershkowitz and colleagues suggest that there are three critical junctures at which we can make a difference. First and foremost, the organization can ensure there's policies and procedures in place. And whenever an employee is inducted into the organization, right versus wrong acts are distinguished, so there's no ambiguity in an employee's mind. Employees can also undergo impact awareness training so that a potential bully is aware of the detrimental impact their behavior might have on their colleagues. If this fails, and bullying happens, then it's possible to put in place secondary interventions. In other words, to enable employees to develop their resilience, maybe through mindfulness training, and to avoid the bullying act to spiral out into open office war. And yet, if the primary and secondary safety nets fail, there's also tertiary interventions after the act, an opportunity to provide mediation and to enable the employee to report the bullying act without fear of repercussion or reprisal, even when it's linked to their manager. So some of the key takeaways I would like to leave you with following this talk are to once again reiterate how damaging and how costly negative acts, such as bullying and harassment, can be for modern organizations. This is so not only because they're invisible, but also because they tend to spiral down, both downwards in terms of increasing severity over time, but also sideways by being contagious and damaging, disrupting the culture of the whole organization. We know that this is a reason that negative acts have to be combated. We are responsible for intervening whenever it's safe for us to do so. And we've looked at three critical stages at which this is possible. And finally, if our position or other particular reasons make it impossible for us to intervene, then there's something we can do. And that is to act with kindness and compassion, which would make the modern workplace a better space for everybody. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for attending this talk. And I hope you come and see us here at the University of Exeter. Thank you.